Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, dwyersportsbetting.com. On Roku in the sports section, the vanity code, one word, is Dwyer Boxing News. Same thing on iTunes. For monthly subscriptions to sports gambling picks, the YouTube channel is Dwyer Sports Betting. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, boxing really is an expectation game, right? Once in a while, a huge fight comes along, big, and the fight itself doesn't deliver. One guy is just too good for the other guy, right? I would put the Kovalev-Bernard Hopkins fight in that category, right? Other examples would be Vladimir Klitschko against David Haye, right? That fight could have been a classic, right? We went into that fight wondering what was going to happen. You might recall you had boxing royalty there in the stadium, right? George Foreman helping introduce Vladimir Klitschko. Lennox Lewis helping to introduce David Haye. Obviously, Vitaly Klitschko was there, right? You're talking about three big-time heavyweight champions for a match between two guys with shares of the heavyweight title. And that fight fell flat, right? I would say Floyd Mayweather against Saul Alvarez. You had two unbeaten fighters, right? You know, people were wondering what was going to happen. Canelo had just beaten Austin Trout. People thought Canelo was ready. Then you saw the first two rounds, and 6 minutes into that fight, you understood. In fact, quite frankly, 90 seconds into that fight, you understood that one guy was just too good for the other. Now, occasionally you have big fights that are mega events before the fight, and then the fight actually goes ahead and delivers, right? I'm telling you, in the 70s, the Thriller in Manila was really one of the high watermarks of the sport. When you were talking about a great boxing match, you would say things like, yeah, this could be like the Thriller in Manila, right? People understood that fight featured two great fighters, and of course the fight itself is a classic. I would say fights that have delivered, that were mega events before the fight, and then as you saw the fight had ebbs and flows. And you were saying, oh my God, am I really watching this? You had to pinch yourself. Would be Joe Calzaghe against Miguel Kessler, battle of unbeatens. Nigel Benn against Chris Eubank. I thought, even though it was one-sided, Manny Pacquiao against Oscar De La Hoya delivered, because that fight had other things going on, a weight dynamic and stuff like that. There was a question on whether De La Hoya, even as he's losing the fight, was going to land a left hand and change the dynamic, right? A lot's going on in that match. Freddie Roach is in Pacquiao's corner. He had been in De La Hoya's corner. There was bad blood between De La Hoya and Freddie Roach. Pacquiao comes in the fight, as I recall, weighing more than De La Hoya. Lots going on. I thought that fight delivered. I thought Manny Pacquiao, Miguel Cotto delivered. Two great fighters. You're wondering what's going to happen. Cotto has moments early, then Pacquiao just takes over definitively. I thought that fight delivered. But what I found is that the real noteworthy fights, right? There's another group of fights. The real noteworthy fights are fights where we didn't even realize at the time what we were watching, right? And after the fight takes place, you look back and you say, wow, that was a moment in time. And then you go back and you look at the film, and as you're watching the film, you're pinching yourself thinking, wow, did these two guys actually fight? Right? These fights provide clarity. Suddenly you understand things you may not have known before. When you look at the guys' careers, and I'm talking about the careers of great fighters, you go back and these fights stand out. But at the time, we didn't fully grasp it, right? To me, as I like to point to, one of the most important fights in the heavyweight division, really in the last 3 decades, was Lennox Lewis against Vitaly Klitschko. Now, it's a head-scratcher today. I mean, it's an absolute head-scratcher that this fight was taken so lightly. I don't even think the fight was on pay-per-view here in the United States. Right? I recall just watching the fight. I remember it was out of Southern California. I don't even think it was in Vegas. I remember watching the fight and then thinking, wow, am I seeing this? Think about it. Vitaly Klitschko, who almost never gets cut, gets a terrible eye injury. He then tries to bring it against Lennox Lewis, who suddenly, after looking terrible, getting hit with bombs, starts landing some counters. Understand the players involved. Lewis has Emmanuel Stewart in his corner. That fight's about as good as it gets. But yet, before the fight, we didn't even think enough of the fight to make it a pay-per-view fight. I'll give you another example. Think about it. We're looking at this hand speed and this talent level of Amir Khan today. Do you remember the Amir Khan-Danny Garcia fight? Think about it. Danny Garcia is still an unbeaten champion. These two guys actually went in the ring. When you watch the fight, Amir Khan's on his front foot. Danny Garcia then decides to draw a line in the sand and starts throwing bombs. That fight's about as good as it gets between two guys on the front page of boxing today. But yet at the time, we didn't even pub that fight that much. It wasn't supposed to be a big fight. Think about it. Khan, Danny Garcia. That wasn't a mega event before it happened. I'll give you another event. Cruiserweight division. We think about Marco Huck as a cruiserweight giant, a guy who gave Alexander Povetkin all he could handle. I consider Povetkin to be one of the best athletes in the sport. Look at Marco Huck in there. Also a great athlete. Think about Marco Huck against Steve Cunningham. That's the fight I'm talking about. You're looking at that fight and you understand, looking back, that's one of the major fights in the cruiserweight division over the last several years. That fight has tremendous drama. Marco Huck folds at the end of that fight. He cannot hang with Steve Cunningham. Right? As you look back, just understand, these are some of the biggest fights in their weight classes for several years. Another such fight, and it's a head scratcher today, because it's easily one of the biggest fights in recent memory, was the first Roy Jones, Bernard Hopkins fight. Right? At the time, not a lot of people knew who Hopkins was. Right? Roy Jones comes in that fight and he's throwing a jab. I encourage you to look at the fight. You see Roy Jones when Roy Jones was Roy Jones. Hopkins, an excellent fighter then, couldn't handle Jones's athleticism and speed. It was on a different level. Now, the reason I mentioned those two is those are the two reference points you need to think about. Hopkins and Jones. When you think about a fight between Kovalev and Pascal. Because understand, Kovalev just beat Bernard Hopkins. Right? You saw Hopkins trying to slow the fight down. You saw Hopkins using angles. You saw Hopkins playing chess. And it didn't work. Kovalev is in front of him. Whatever Hopkins has showing, Kovalev is hitting. Kovalev has a lot of volume. Kovalev is pushing the issue. He's not allowing Hopkins time to think. He's on his front foot. He's being active. Hopkins doesn't have to go searching for Kovalev. Kovalev is right in front of him. It's a two-handed attack. When Hopkins goes back, Kovalev goes forward. Right? Hopkins has his hands like this. Kovalev is hitting him on his hands. Kovalev comes in. He dips down. He's hitting Hopkins to the body. He's keeping Hopkins busy. He's not allowing Hopkins to get breathers. He's not allowing Hopkins to pace himself. Well, now you're going to have the other side of the coin. Because understand, Kovalev is going from fighting Hopkins to fighting a fighter trained by Roy Jones. Right? Understand, Kovalev is literally going through the giants of around the weight class. Right? I say around the weight class because both Hopkins and Roy Jones have careers that span several weight classes. Just understand he's gone from one style, Hopkins, Nassim Richardson. Now he's going to go in a different area. This fight is qualitatively different, in my opinion, than Kovalev against Bernard Hopkins. The Roy Jones style is very different. Jean Pascal is a different fighter than Bernard Hopkins. I know Hopkins beat Pascal. Right? Trust me, I know it well. I have my pre-fight videos for those fights still here up on YouTube. You can check them out if you have time. Right? But boxing's rock, paper, scissors. Understand, as Kovalev jumps on Bernard Hopkins, there isn't the threat of imminent danger that there is with Jean Pascal. I know YouTube Nation disagrees with me, but for a while now I've been saying Pascal is one of the hardest punchers in the sport of boxing. I encourage people to look at the Silvio Blanco footage on YouTube involving Jean Pascal. He doesn't even have to set his feet well to get off big punches. Dare I say, he's like his mentor, Roy Jones. Right? Understand, before Roy Jones got involved in Pascal's corner, Pascal in interviews would openly talk about how Roy Jones was one of the figures who inspired him to become a professional boxer. Understand, one of the secrets with Roy Jones is he married athleticism and hand speed with a horrific left hook. We talk about guys like Jeff Left Hook Lacey, and you notice the left hook. Maybe it's because Roy Jones was so flashy with other punches that we ignore the fact that in his prime, Roy Jones hit very hard. I want people to look at the Vinny Paz fight against Roy Jones. Right? Roy Jones was a guy who liked to fool around with spacing. He'd be outside, then he'd come in throwing bombs. I consider Roy Jones to be really the father of ambush fighting. Right? When I think of David Haye, when I think of Jean Pascal, I'm thinking of Roy Jones Jr. My preliminary thought on this fight is that it's different than the Hopkins fight, which went the distance. It's different than Pascal's fight against Lucien Boutte, which went the distance. Here, something's got to give. Everything about this fight's going to be different than the Hopkins fight. You know, against Hopkins, you know, there's not the big punch coming back at light heavyweight, right? Hopkins was a great middleweight, right? I would argue he's a Hall of Famer off his light heavyweight credentials too, but he wasn't a big puncher at light heavyweight. Here you're dealing with a fighter, Jean Pascal, who has a problem making light heavyweight. Look at his weight problems of late. Look at the weights at which he's come in for some of these fights. He's a big guy at light heavyweight with a big punch. Right? Understand, Kovalev went 12 rounds with Hopkins. doesn't have a lot of experience going 12 rounds. I believe that Hopkins fight is the first fight Kovalev goes longer than 8 rounds. Understand, too, Hopkins is a defensive genius. Right? Hopkins still hasn't been knocked out since the 1970s or something like that. I mean, it's impossible to knock out Bernard Hopkins. And keep in mind, this is a guy who's been in with big hitters. Right? You know, Kelly Pavlik, long list of big hitters. Tavares Cloud. Right? Jean Pascal. Understand, with Pascal, he's not as defensively gifted as Hopkins. If he can't handle Kovalev's front foot, if he can't handle Kovalev's volume, something's got to give. Right? How do you beat an ambush fighter? In my opinion, you follow him after the ambush. If Kovalev's as front foot heavy as he was against Bernard Hopkins and is balanced, how does Jean Pascal survive this fight? But there's a flip side. If Kovalev was down in multiple fights, as he has been, how do we know he's remotely prepared for a Jean Pascal ambush? Let me point out, too, there are multiple Pascal fights. Multiple Pascal fights. Where 1 minute his opponent's completely lucid. The next minute the opponent is completely unconscious. There are also multiple Pascal fights. He's an intriguing figure in boxing. Where you're watching the fight, you say, oh, Jean Pascal has this, then suddenly a shoulder pops out of place. I'm not kidding. Right? There are fights where Pascal goes to the corner and his corner has to put his shoulder back in place. Right? There are other fights where Pascal hurts a shoulder, can't even throw a left hand. Still gets knocked down because he hits that hard. Right? With his other hand. But understand, if he hurts a shoulder and he's dealing with a concussive puncher in Sergey Kovalev, there's no place to go. Right? Kovalev's tough enough to deal with when you have 2 hands. When you have 1 hand, it's just too tough. So my initial read on this fight is this fight's a different set of fight styles, different pacing, different punching power, different mindset than Kovalev against Bernard Hopkins. Right? This is that dangerous fight where I believe distance is going to determine everything. My initial inclination here is to take both guys by KO. What I'll do, though, is I'll wait till the odds for the fight are finalized and solidified. Because if one guy is heavily favored over the other guy, right, then the play might be to take the underdog hedged with the other guy by KO. This way you would also get the underdog simply to win the fight. Right, that would give you a chance to double up if that underdog wins the fight by KO. Right, you would, I'll just put it to you this way. Right now, December 18th, 2014, and this fight's not for 4 months. I just don't see how Jean Pascal, Sergey Kovalev, goes the distance. I'm still not sold on Kovalev's stamina, even though he had plenty of stamina in the Hopkins fight, and that surprised me. I'm not sold on his stamina against a big puncher who's always going to threaten you with that threat of violence. Understand, that drains your energy. You're fighting an ambush fighter, but at the same time, you have to watch him. If I'm fighting David Haye, if Haye's a little far away from me, I can't relax. I can't save energy. I can't, look at my watch and say, okay, great, this is a slow round. Because the guy can do a drop step and suddenly hit me with a bomb. So it is with Jean Pascal. Right? So I don't see this fight going the distance. My first bet on this is not a side. It's to take both guys by KO. That's my first inclination. It's that the fight won't go the distance. right? If the odds allow, and we'll do a follow-up video on this when the odds become finalized and stuff like that. If the odds allow, if I'm getting much greater than even money on one side of the play, then I'll take the underdog, because the goal is always to get leverage on the casino, and I'll hedge the play with the favorite by KO. Hopefully at better than even money on both sides of the play. That's how I see this fight. Let me know how you see this fight. Leave your comments for me here online. Let me just say this too. I know Jean Pascal is a controversial figure with many people here online. I've mentioned his punching power. Understand, he has fights against guys where he knocked the guy down multiple times. The Kaczynski fight, for example. He knocks the guy down multiple times, but the guy survives to go the distance. Right? Understand, too, Pascal has fought other guys who are defensively gifted. Right? Bernard Hopkins. Chad Dawson, when he's not getting caught cold early in a fight. Right? Pascal hits hard. It's a rare guy who can hit you with either hand when you're fully conscious without really a preceding combination and actually take you out. Understand too, Hopkins, notoriously slow starter. Jean Pascal's a very fast starter. Right? Look at the Chad Dawson fight. Right? Pascal also has hand speed that Bernard Hopkins does not have. Right? I would think this dynamic would get going a lot faster than Kovalev's fight against Bernard Hopkins. Kovalev himself might feel that, hey, now I know I can make it past the 8th round. He might fight differently with a little bit more confidence. This fight would get going much more quickly. This fight's a bonfire. I don't see how it goes 12 rounds. Since it's a championship fight for several belts, it would be scheduled for 12 rounds. Let me hear from you. Leave your comments for me here online. Visit us at gamblersadvisory.com. Thanks for stopping by.